This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to books and ideas and everything in between. This episode is brought to you by YIVO, the Institute for Jewish Research. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern, and my guest today is a theater creator and actor who has been instrumental in bringing Yiddish theater in New York back to life. The title of his one-man show, The Big Bobkis, A Complete Gentile's Guide to Yiddish Vaudeville, already discloses part of his unusual story. Shane Baker, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Shalom.
So I think it's safe to say that for most people who deal with the Yiddish culture, it's a rediscovery. They're reconnecting with what the culture of their community was 2 or 3 generations ago. For you, it was a discovery rather than a rediscovery.
I guess so. I mean, the rumors are true. I am indeed a Sheigetz of the Gentile Persuasion. But Yiddish theater plays an important part in American and world culture and humor. As a kid growing up, I think my first exposure to Yiddish was when my father took me to see the Marx Brothers movie Animal Crackers, which had just been re-released, I think in 74 maybe. And Groucho sings, "Hooray for Captain Spaulding, the African explorer. Did someone call me Schnorrer?" And the whole audience laughed. So I said, "Why is that funny? What's a Schnorrer?" And found out that there's a whole language that I didn't know anything about. So that was interesting.
What sent you on the direction to engage with it more seriously and professionally?
Well, I was always interested in theater, even as a kid. And reading about theater, American theater and world theater, Yiddish theater plays an important role. Here in America, for instance, Stella Adler, who taught Marlon Brando how to act, among many, many others, was probably a bigger success on the Yiddish stage than she ever was on the American English language stage. She was Yiddish theater royalty. She was the daughter of Jacob P. Adler, one of the greats of the Yiddish stage of all time, and she herself was quite well known and beloved on the Yiddish stage, and she helped to bring Stanislavski's method to America, because I guess she knew the Russian to help bring that. So you see there another example. They talk about it in folk songs, for instance, that Yiddish is interesting for cross-cultural contact in particular, transmitting songs. Well, she brought a whole theatrical method to America. So what is this Yiddish theater, I was wondering.
So you're saying essentially that Yiddish theater is part and parcel of the heritage of American theater, that it cannot be separated from it. And, sooner or later, it will be obvious to everyone that Yiddish theater was one of the pillars of the historical pillars of American theater. Are they inseparable?
I don't know if things become more obvious to people over time. I think they get buried. We have to keep reminding people, I guess, as we get further and further from origins. But I would agree that that's so.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think that in musical programs, for instance, they like to point out that George Gershwin lifted this or that line from a Yiddish lullaby or a Yiddish song. And you go down the line and you see that Yiddish is an influence. It's, part and parcel, as you say.
So what really tipped the balance for you to engage with Yiddish theater? How did that come about? That, Yiddish theater became the central occupation of you as a theater creator.
I look back and I'm still scratching my head wondering how and why. I came to New York in 1993 to work in the theater. And when I got here, I said, I'll check out what is this Yiddish theater that I've heard so much about. And so I went to see a show at the Old Volksbühne when it was then under the direction of Zephoira Speisman. A lichtigen Gan Eden soll sie haben. And I saw Mirela Evros. That was, I think, in late 93 or early 94. Mirela Evros is, for those who don't know, it's the Jewish Queen Lear. It's called the Jewish Queen Lear because there is a Jewish King Lear by the same author, and by another author there is King Lear in Jewish, in Yiddish. Why programs about ungrateful children should be popular in the Yiddish theater, I'm not going to enter into that, but I saw that, and they had a lot of the last of the Mohicans, so to speak, of the Yiddish stage: Shifra Lehrer, Felix Fiebig, Zipporah Speisman, and Mina.
Jewish theater in New York was alive and kicking until the 90s. I mean, it was a fixture of the New York culture even well into the end of the 20th century.
I think it's still a fixture, if you ask me. I mean, it's no different from many of the other ethnic theaters that are active here in town.
Was there no lull ever?
I mean, everything's in waves, yeah. I think you can say that, Yiddish theater was dying out at a certain point, but then you go back and there were independent productions that were coming into town. They say that maybe Joseph Buloff with the Volksbühne, some of his productions, those were the last, Second Avenue productions. But if you look again, then you see that Mary Soriano was coming in the 70s and 80s, and she was a big star. And then there are other productions that are happening in the late 80s and the 90s, and the Volksbühne has been going for 100 years or more. And everyone said, well, that's the end. And then in the 2000s, David Mandelbaum created the New Yiddish Rep, with which I've worked. And so it's an up and down process. It's not like it was on Second Avenue in the 1920s and 30s, but things change.
So you arrived in New York in the 90s and you were exposed to all these productions and to all these last remaining greats of the Yiddish theater.
Well, I saw that Mirela Efros, and I fell in love with my first Yiddish actress. She was 92 and I was 25, and that was Mina Byrne. And Mina was a great, great influence on me. She had a beautiful, beautiful scene in that show. Theatrically. She played the Bezish figure, the wicked the wicked mother-in-law, who's kind of the instigator of much of the trouble in the show. But there was a scene where her daughter carries out some bit of villainy, and Mina was sitting there on the stage with no lines, just sitting there in a chair watching the action take place, and the way her eyes glittered, you knew that she was behind all of it. And how someone can, without emotion, steal a scene is still a mystery to me. But that was Mina. I went to hear her speak a few months later, and she told her story, but someone had introduced me to her. It had inspired me to start learning Yiddish, her performance. At that time, they were giving the translations via headphone, like the UN. But I kept taking my headphones off because I'm at Yiddish theater. I want to hear Yiddish, but I couldn't understand the Yiddish. I said, I wish I understood what they're saying. So I started to study Yiddish. And when I went to that seminar to hear Mina speak, she was to speak in English. But she met me, a young person who wants to learn Yiddish. And when she went up to the podium, she said, there's a young man here who's studying Yiddish, and I'm supposed to tell my story, so I'd like him to hear my story in my language. If nobody objects, I'll speak in Yiddish, and if you don't understand, raise your hand and I'll translate into my unaccented English. And she spoke in Yiddish, which I understood maybe 40% or a third of what she said at that time. But it was a big signal to me that there's this group of people who want this culture to be continued, who want to share this culture, who want it to grow, who will welcome me in with open arms. And that was a watershed moment for me, I'd say.
Were you welcomed with open arms? because your personal family heritage is so different so removed from that scene?
Yes. Yeah.
That never posed a problem.
No. A little bit lately, I think professionally sometimes lately, as people quibble over roles or work, but no, not with the older generation, not with the European generation, certainly, or continentals, as Feivish Finkel liked to call them. They were very welcoming to me, and it was remarkable. It was remarkable. I think they saw someone with an earnest interest in what they had to share, and that was good enough for them.
How would you characterize theatre goers for the Yiddish theatre these days? I'm sure that there isn't just one profile, but maybe a collective portrait of the people, the young Americans, or maybe not that young. I mean, we're not talking about the greats of yore. They're all gone now, I'm assuming. But who are the people that engage with Yiddish theatre these days?
The audience you're asking
Yes.
about. It's a mix. The mission is always to expand the audience, to grow the audience. There are a lot of people who merely have some sentiment for Yiddish and don't necessarily understand it, but they come anyway because of their family heritage. We try to pick properties that we think will be interesting to people who might not have much connection to Yiddish at all. Waiting for Godot, for instance, in Yiddish, it's a very nice fit of a play. It has a Yiddish tam, especially the way Moshe Asur directed it, maybe especially with my translation, which people seem to like. But it's a play that's known outside of the Yiddish repertoire, so there are Beckett scholars and theater lovers who are going to come see that play anyway. In fact, in Ireland, when we played it at a Beckett festival there, I overheard, they weren't speaking to me and they didn't recognize me from the stage, but I overheard Irish folk talking amongst themselves, saying that's the first time they ever understood Waiting for Godot. Frankly, I think that Samuel Beckett might have turned in his grave because he didn't like people to say they understood. But
do you think there's something about the Yiddish rendition that adds a certain value to the play? I mean, what was the purpose of translating it into Yiddish if it already exists in English?
Well, I would have to tie it specifically to the production that we had with the new Yiddish rep and with Moshe Asur's direction, because they're tied together intimately to my mind. It made very specific what Beckett generally likes to remove from his plays. He likes to remove many of the specifics that give too much color. In his initial drafts of Waiting for Godot, the character of Estragon was named Levi. It was a Jewish character. It was written directly after World War II. So the concept of two people waiting in the countryside, wondering, is someone going to come who can give us work, who can give us food, after Beckett himself had spent time in the south of France hiding out as a member of the French resistance, it suddenly makes a little more sense. It's not so strange. It becomes, aha, this is a concrete experience. This isn't just two figures waiting in a sterile white stage environment with a modernist tree. This is two people who are worried about where their next meal is going to come from, if strangers are going to come and beat them, and where they're going to be able to sleep.
Mm-hmm. So, and also conversely, do you think that, say, a Yiddish production of Mira Le'Efros and an English production of Mira Le'Efros would have a different effect on the audience?
100%. 100%. There are a lot of translations into English, some better, some worse, and there are different types of translation too. When we perform in Yiddish, we depend on translation, very often supertitle translation, particularly for dramatic works, just like in an opera. There's also a style of on-the-spot direct translation on the stage that's been in particular pioneered by Alan Lewis Rickman, a good friend and co-worker of mine. That's a little bit more unusual. We play, for instance, right now a scene called Saligen in a show that we've got up, Tevye Served Raw. That's the original Sholem Aleichem stories. So in that we have a story, it's a lie, Saligen. And there are two of us on a train talking to each other in Yiddish, Yelena Shmulenson and I. Yelena and Alan are a couple, they're married. But Alan stands in the middle, so Yelena turns to me, she turns to Alan really, he's in the middle, she says, "Ihr fort dacht mir ken Colomé?" Then Alan translates talking to me. "I believe you're traveling to Colomé?" Then I answer in Yiddish, "Von wann weißt du das ken Colomé? How'd you know?" And it goes on like that. And that style is very lively and dynamic, and there you get both Yiddish and English, and the translation is a part of the show. It's inseparable from the Yiddish. But without the Yiddish there, you can have a very fine production, I believe. You can have a great production, probably. But it's not the same flavor, it's not the same vitamins that you get when you have the Yiddish there.
Mm-hmm. Do you see yourself as like working as in a scene? You mentioned ethnic theater before. But do you see Yiddish theater as having the same challenges, the same promises as other types of ethnic theaters in New York? Do you look sideways sometimes to see what the others are doing and maybe take inspiration from them or collaborate with them?
If I were smarter, had more time, I guess I'd look sideways. But we're generally looking ahead. Where do we get our next booking? What's the next show that we're going to do? And we'll leave it to someone like Ivo to look at the past and see whatever it was that we did, I guess. But there is something called the Immigrant Arts Coalition that a fellow named Chris Massamine at the National Yiddish Theater Volksbühne, they remade themselves when Zalman Mlotek and Eleanor Risa took over in the 90s. And now it's... They've got the Yiddish fiddler on the roof up, and they're going gangbusters. And there's a fellow there named Chris Massamine who I think brought them into, maybe helped to create something called the Immigrant Arts Coalition. And that is looking sideways. But I've not been involved with an organization that's involved with that, not while it certainly wasn't there during my time at the Volksbühne.
What about Israeli and Hebrew theater? Do you see a special connection, a special relationship between Yiddish theater and Hebrew theater?
Well, I wasn't part of it, but there was a recent production of some of Hanoch Levin's plays in Yiddish and in Hebrew that New Yiddish Rep put up. And the fellow who translated them, Eli Rosen, he tells me that it's remarkable how Hebrew goes into Yiddish, that it's a really nice and easy fit.
No, actually, it's strange that you say that, because I think that Hanoch Levin plays perhaps would work better in Yiddish than they do in Hebrew.
Some people said that. I saw only the Yiddish version of The Whore from Ohio, and quite a nice translation. But I don't really know his work other than that, so I couldn't compare for you. But that could be a way forward there in Israel too, I think, if you take a writer who's that beloved and put him into Hebrew. I also saw recently this production by Gesher of the Dibuk. Of course, it wasn't Ansky's Dibuk. It was a modern version of the Dibuk, and it was quite lovely. I went because my friend Mendy Kahan from Jung Yiddish of Tel Aviv was in it, playing the rabbi, and Badchen. But it seemed to fit quite nicely. Yeah.
Do you think that, unlike Waiting for Godot, there are plays written in Gentile language that you think would work, need to be translated into Yiddish that, lend themselves specifically to a Yiddish translation?
I'm sure there are. It would be a case-by-case process. I have thought, for instance, that the importance of being earnest in Yiddish could be hysterically funny because it's a comedy of manners to a degree, and I think that it could be put into a Hasidic context very easily and nicely, where there is still that very highly mannered society with registers of behavior that must not be violated. So, it depends. It would go production by production, I would say.
I would definitely see that. All right, Shane Baker, theater creator and actor, the star of the one-man show, The Big Bobkiss, a complete Gentile's guide to Yiddish vaudeville, and a fixture of the Yiddish theater here in New York City. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.